everyone. We have been going on an adventure together, you and I, reading the book, The Greatest Miracle in the World by Mandino. And today we begin chapter 3 of The Greatest Miracle in the World by Mandino. If you need to see the other chapters, they're included here in this group, and I will provide the links for you. So chapter 3. Several days later, I was getting out of my car in the parking lot. I heard my name being called with the volume of sound only slightly lower in decibel count than the public address system at Wrigley Field. I looked around but couldn't see him. Mr. Ogg, up here. Simon was leaning out of his second-floor apartment window over a plant-filled window box, waving a small blue watering can to attract my attention. I waved. Mr. Ogg, your book. Don't forget your promise. I nodded. He pointed inside his apartment. This evening, before you go home? I nodded again. He smiled and shouted, I'll have your sherry ready. I threw him a circled thumb and forefinger and locked the car and headed for the problems of the day. Simon Potter, who are you? Simon Potter, what are you? Simon Potter, why are you? Like some simple, almost forgotten roundelay from my youth, I found myself silently repeating these 3 questions in time with my steps as I hurried toward the office. I'd been unable to get a handle on my feelings about the old man, and it bothered me. He fascinated me, and for some inexplicable reason, he frightened me. Both his appearance and his demeanor fit all my preconceived notions of how biblical prophets and mystics must have looked and acted, and I would think about him at the strangest times, in the middle of a budget meeting, while reading submitted articles, when writing a book review. His face, his voice, his charismatic manner would intrude themselves into whatever I was thinking and momentarily wipe out my concentration. Who was he? Where did he come from? What was this latter-day Isaiah doing in my life? Maybe I'd get some answers this evening. For my own peace of mind, I hope so. Toward closing time, I asked Pat Smith, my secretary, to requisition a copy of my book, The Greatest Salesman in the World, from our inventory. She paused in the doorway after placing the book in my hands. Anything else, Ogg? No thanks, Pat. See you in the morning. Good night. Good night, and don't forget to turn off the coffee machine. I won't. You said that last time you worked late, and it ruined 2 pots. I heard her lock the outside door while I sat holding the book, my creation, that was now being acclaimed by publishers weekly as the bestseller that nobody knows. In 4 years, it had never made the big city bestseller list, and yet a phenomenal sale of 400,000 hardcover copies. It had already outsold every hardcover edition of every book written by Harold Robbins, Irving Wallace, or Jacqueline Suzanne. Now there were rumors that several paperback houses were interested in acquiring the reprint rights, and they were talking big money, 6-digit money, home run. What if it all happened? Could I handle it? Could I cope with all that sudden wealth and the national publicity that would surely follow a phenomenal campaign conducted by any of the large paperback houses? What kind of a personal price would I end up paying for all of this? Would I regret it later? I remembered what Simon had said about the lifetime prisons we build around ourselves. Would this kind of success be a key to release myself, or a key to lock myself in? What more did I want from life anyway? Would I change my lifestyle if I had that kind of financial freedom? Who can really ever have an answer to these questions before the fact? I tried to put all of the what-if thoughts out of my mind and opened the book to autograph it for Simon. What could I inscribe on the flyleaf that would be appropriate for this saint-like man? Somehow the proper words were important to me, and what would an expert on Gilbran, Plutarch, Plato, Seneca, and Isley think of my little book after he'd read it? That was important to me. I began to write. For for Simon Potter, God's finest ragpicker, with love, Og Mandino. I remembered to turn off the coffee machine, turning on the burglar alarm, flicked off the lights, locked up, and walked across the shadowing parking lot to his apartment building. I found number 21 scrawled in yellow crayon above one of the lobby mailboxes, hit the yellow button twice, and climbed the stairs. Simon was waiting for me in the hall. You remembered. You reminded me. Ah, yes. Like most old men, I am both rude and presumptuous. Forgive me my trespasses, Mr. Og. Come in, come in. While we were still standing, we conducted our exchange. I handed him my book, and he gave me a glass of sherry. He frowned when he read the title. The Greatest Salesman in the World? Very interesting. May I guess whom that might be? You'll never guess, Simon. It's not who you think it is. Then he opened the cover and read my inscription. His face seemed to soften when he looked at me. His big brown eyes were moist. Thank you. I know I shall enjoy it. But why did you inscribe it in such a manner? Ragpicker, yes. But God's finest? I pointed towards his stacks of books. When I was here before, you were telling me about your theory that some books were written and guided by the hand of God. I just figured that if you could recognize when a writer had been touched by God's hand, you must be a special friend of his. He studied my face intently, staring at me for an interminably uncomfortable minute before I broke our eye contact. And you would like me to read your book and decide whether or not I think it belongs in the same category as the others, assisted by the hand of God, as it were. I don't know whether I want you to do that or not, Simon. Maybe subconsciously I do, but I hadn't thought about it. All I know for sure is that I get the strangest premonitions when I'm with you. You're in my mind a good deal, and I don't know why. The old man leaned his head back on his overstuffed chair and closed his eyes. A premonition is a forewarning, a foreboding of something about to happen. Is that how you feel when you are with me, or when you think about me? I'm not quite sure that explains the sensation. Perhaps it is a feeling that we have met before, or shared some experience in the past. What do the French call it? Ah, yes, déjà vu. That's closer to it. Have you ever had a dream, and then when you awoke, you tried and tried to remember it, and all that remained in your memory were shadows and unrecognizable voices with no meaning and no relationship to your life? The old man nodded. Many times. Well, that's how I feel when I'm with you or think about you. I guess the kids would call it vibes, only I can't characterize it because I've never experienced it before. The mind is a very strange mechanism, Mr. Og. Simon, I wouldn't even begin to guess how many books and magazine articles I've read about the mind in the past 10 years for possible use in my magazine, yet the more I read, the more I've come to realize how very little we know about that mystery within us, or even where it's located. The old man rubbed his hands across his cheek and said, Dr. Carl Menninger wrote that the human mind is far more than the brain's little bag of tricks. It is instead the entire personality made up of human instincts, habits, memories, organs, muscles, and sensations, all going through a constantly changing process. I know Dr. Menninger. Personally? Really? Yes. What kind of man is he? He's a giant of a man, almost your size, a beautiful man like you, and he always has a twinkle in his eyes when he speaks. Is there, what do you call it, a twinkle in my eyes, Mr. Og? Sometimes, Simon, sometimes. He smiled sadly. I like best what Milton wrote about the mind. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. Mr. Ogg, our mind is the greatest creation on earth, and it can generate the most sublime happiness for its owner, or it can destroy him. Yet although we have been given the secret of how to control it for our happiness and benefit, we still function completely ignorant of its potential, like the most stupid of animals. The secret of how to control our mind for our benefit? Simon pointed toward the book stacks. It's all there. One has only to study the treasures that lay exposed all around us. For countless centuries, man compared his mind to a garden. Seneca said that soil, no matter how rich, could not be productive without cultivation, and neither could our minds. Sir Joshua Reynolds wrote that our mind was only barren soil, soon exhausted and unproductive unless it was continually fertilized with new ideas. And James Allen, in his monumental classic, As a Man Thinketh, wrote that a man's mind was like a garden which may be intelligently cultivated or allowed to run wild, but whether cultivated or neglected, it would produce. If no useful seeds were planted, then an abundance of useless weed seeds would fall into the land, and the result would be wrong, useless, harmful, and impure plants. In other words, whatever we allow to enter our minds will always bear fruit. I lit a cigarette and hung on his every word. Now, man is comparing his mind to a computer, but his conclusions are the same as Seneca's and the others. The computer people have a phrase, actually, and an acronym, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. If one puts faulty information into a computer, out will come faulty answers. So it is with our minds. Whether one is thinking in terms of a garden or, say, IBM 360. Put negative material in and that's what you'll reap. On the other hand, if you program in or plant beautiful, positive, correct thoughts and ideas, that's what you'll harvest. So it's simple, you see. You can actually become whatever you are thinking. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Allen wrote, man is made or unmade by himself in the armory of thought. He forges the weapons by which he destroys himself. He also fashions the tools with which he builds for himself heavenly mansions of joy and strength and peace. By the right choice and true appreciation of thought, man ascends to the divine perfection. Mr. Ogg, note those words, by the right choice. They are the cornerstone of happy life, and perhaps at some other time you will let me elaborate. In other words, Simon, you're saying that we can program our minds, but how? Very simple. We can do it for ourselves, or others will do it for us, merely by hearing or reading a thought or an affirmation, whether it be truthful or the vilest of lies. Over and over, our minds will eventually imprint that thought, and it will become a permanent part of our personality, so strong that we will even act on it without consideration or reflection in the future. Hitler, you may recall, did this to an entire country, and brainwashing is a phrase with which we are all too familiar after many sad experiences by our captured troops in the Orient. We become what we think, always. This seemed like a good opportunity to do some probing, so I took it. Simon, tell me about yourself. Do you mind? He shook his head, placed the wine glass on the lamp table, folded his hands in his lap, and looked down at them as he spoke. I do not mind. This opportunity has not come to me in many years, and I also realize that you are hoping I might touch upon some fact, some clue that will clarify whatever seems to concern you about our relationship. First, I am 78 years old and in good health. I have been in this country since 1946. You came here right after the war. Yes. What did you do before the war? He smiled. I realize it will require a good deal of blind faith on your part to believe me, but I headed the largest export-import firm in Germany, that dealt exclusively with goods from the Middle East. My home was in Frankfurt, but the firm's main office was in, I interrupted, Damascus. He glanced at me strangely. Yes, Mr. Ogg, Damascus. I rubbed my hand across my face and down the rest of the sherry. How did I know that? For some inexplicable reason, I had the sudden urge to get up and run out of his apartment. Instead, I just sat there with two absolutely immobile legs, paralyzed by an unknown dilemma. I did not want to hear any more, and yet I wanted to hear it all. The reporter in me finally won, and I began firing questions at him like some ambitious country prosecutor. He responded to each of my questions at his own pace. Simon, did you have any branch offices? 10. In cities such as Jerusalem, Baghdad, Alexandria, Cairo, Beirut, Aleppo. 10? 10. What kind of merchandise did you export and import? Mostly goods with some degree of rarity and value. Finished wools, linens, fine glassware, precious stones, the finest rugs, some leather goods, coated papers. Your firm, you said, was large? We were the largest of its kind in the world. Our annual sales volume, even in the midst of the Depression in 1936, exceeded more than $200 million in American currency. And you were company president? Simon cocked his head slyly. It is not difficult to be company president when one is sole owner and founder, and he held up my book, pointing to the title, also the company's top salesman. My host rose and refilled my glass. I downed half of it as I studied him carefully. Was he putting me on? Finally, I grasped his arm and turned him gently toward me so that I was staring directly into his eyes. Simon, in truth, you have already read my book? Forgive me, Mr. Ogg, but I've never seen a copy of your book until this evening. Why? The Greatest Salesman in the World is set in the time of Christ. It tells the story of a young camel boy, Hafid, who had ambitions to become a salesman in order to earn his share of the gold that he saw were the fruits of the efforts of the other salesmen in the caravan. Finally, after many rebuffs, Hafid is given one robe by the caravan master and dispatched to a nearby village called Bethlehem to prove that he can sell. Instead, the youth, after failing to sell the robe for 3 humiliating days, presents it to warm a newborn baby sleeping in a manger in a cave. Then he returns to the caravan, believing he'd failed as a salesman, never noticing the bright star that followed him. But the caravan master interprets the star as a sign that had been prophesied many years before, and he gives our young man 10 scrolls of success, which the youth eventually applies to his life to become the greatest salesman in the world. That is a very touching plot, Mr. Ogg. There's more, Simon. When the youth, Hafid, becomes wealthy and powerful, he establishes his main warehouse in a certain city. Would you care to guess the city? Damascus? Yes. And in time, he opens other warehouses and branches throughout the Middle East. How many, Simon? 10? Yes, again. And all the goods he sold, as described in my book, were the same goods you sold. The old man turned his head away from me and spoke very slowly. Those are exceedingly strange coincidences, Mr. Ogg. I pressed on. Tell me about your family, Simon. He hesitated for several minutes before speaking again. Well, as I mentioned, my home was in Frankfurt. Actually, we lived in a suburb, Sachsenhausen, on a lovely estate in the sight of the River Main. Yet my time there was limited. It seemed as if I was always saying goodbye to my family at the airport. More and more, I came to hate the days and weeks when I was apart from my wife and young son. Finally, in 1935, I decided to do something about my life. I made very careful plans for the future. I decided to work very hard until 1940, and then I would take from the business sufficient assets for my family and me to live comfortably for the rest of our lives. Then I would transfer controlling interest in the company to those in my employ who had been so loyal to me throughout the years. I interrupted him again, and this time my voice broke. Simon, when you read my book, you will learn that my great salesman Hafid finally gave his business and most of his wealth to those who had helped him build it. The old man was frowning and shaking his head at me. That cannot be. That cannot be. You'll read for yourself. And what of your family? By this time, Hitler had come to power. Yet I, like most business people, had no idea of the monster we had blindly allowed to take control of our country. My wife was a Jew, and while I was away on one of my many trips to Damascus, I was visited one day by one of Hitler's agents. He calmly notified me that both my wife and son were in what he called protective custody, and they would be released to me only upon my signing over to the National Socialist Party my entire company and all its assets. I signed without hesitation. Then I immediately flew back to Frankfurt and was arrested by the secret police at the airport gate. I spent the entire war years being trucked from one concentration camp to another. Not being a Jew, I guess, saved my life. And your wife and son? I never saw them again. I started to say I'm sorry, but I didn't. And your business? Gone. Everything confiscated by the Nazis. After the war, I spent nearly 4 years trying to find any clue concerning my family. Both the American and British were most cooperative and sympathetic. Finally, I learned through American intelligence that both my wife and son had been murdered and cremated at Dachau almost immediately after they'd been taken captive. It was tough to continue. I felt like some cruel inquisitor, forcing the old man to relive memories that he had long ago probably pushed into the background of his mind in order to maintain his sanity. Still, I continued. How did you get to this country? In my affluent days, I had made many fine friends in Washington. One of them interceded with the proper immigration authorities who waived my lack of passport. Another loaned me money for the passage. I visited Chicago in 1931 and liked its vitality, so I came here. What have you been doing all these years? He shrugged his shoulders and stared up at the ceiling. What can an ex-millionaire company president whose ambitions all died in a gas chamber do? I worked at 100 odd jobs only to survive. Night club janitor, cook, city sanitation work, construction work, anything. I knew I had all the necessary knowledge, experience, and ability to start a new business of my own, but I had no stomach for it anymore. There was no reason to succeed or to acquire wealth, so I made no effort. Finally, I passed the city examinations and became a school janitor on Foster Avenue. That was very good for me. I was around laughing children all day. Very good. And now, when I see a lad that reminded me of my Eric, every now and then, I would see a lad that reminded me of my Eric. It was a fine, decent job. I retired when I was 65, and the city began paying me a small pension, enough to live and read. Whatever made you decide to become what you call a ragpicker? Simon smiled and leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling again as if trying to remember the details of an event that had long been undisturbed among his memories. I moved into this small apartment soon after I retired. Lazarus, myself, and my books. Each morning it became a ritual for Lazarus and me to walk completely around this block. One morning as I was leaving the building, I happened to look across the gate to the parking lot where I first met you, and there was a young lady who appeared to be in some sort of difficulty. Her automobile was parked at the approach to the gate, which was down, and she was angrily pounding on the metal box which accepts the coins that activate the gate. I went over to her and asked if I could be of assistance. She was crying, and in between her sobs, she told me that she had put her last 2 quarters in the coin box and the gate had not risen. Furthermore, she was doing class at Loyola in less than 10 minutes for a final exam. I did what anyone else would have done. I removed 2 quarters from my pants pocket, dropped them in the coin slot, and this time the gate went up. Then I continued my walk with Lazarus. By now the man was pacing the room. We had not gone very far when I heard footsteps hurrying up behind me, and I turned to see the lovely young lady coming toward me, still with tears in her eyes, but smiling. Before I realized what she was doing, she had reached up, thrown her arms around me, pulled me down to her, kissed me on the cheek. The first time a woman had embraced me since my wife. The young lady said nothing. There was just the hug and a kiss, and then she scampered off. That trivial incident was what gave my life a new meaning and direction, Mr. Ogg. I resolved to stop hiding in my apartment, to stop feeling sorry for what life had given me, and to begin giving some of myself to others after all the years of self-pity. Actually, you see, it was a selfish decision because the feeling that went through me when that grateful girl kissed me was one I had not known for many years. It was a feeling that only comes when one has helped another with no thought of personal gain. I have been a rag picker ever since. I felt drained. The questions and answers had exhausted me. Still, there was one thing more I wanted to know. Simon, you mentioned that your son's name was Eric. What was your wife's name? Mr. Ogg, my wife had a name as lovely as her soul. Leisha. All I could do was sigh and whisper, Simon, please hand me my book. The old gentleman placed the book in my lap. I turned hurriedly through the first few pages and stopped on page 14. Simon, look. Here, where I'm pointing halfway down the page, is the name I gave to the wife of Hafid, the greatest salesman in the world. Read it. A half sob, half cry of anguish escaped from the old man's lips as he focused on the printed page, and then he looked up at me, unbelieving, large tears forming in those unforgettable eyes. It cannot be. It cannot be. He took the book in his giant hands, staring intently at the page. Finally, he raised it to his cheek, caressed it gently against his beard, and murmured softly over and over, Leisha, Leisha, Leisha. Thank you for joining me today. That is the end of chapter 3 of The Greatest Miracle in the World. And we'll be back tomorrow with chapter 4. Have a great day, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.